In March of 1952, Ronald Reagan married Nancy Davis, beginning a legendary romance and partnership that would span more than 50 years. Their journey took them from Hollywood to the California governor's mansion, to the White House, and finally back to California, where ultimately they'd face a devastating disease. We sat down with Nancy Reagan in California to discuss the extraordinary life she shared with Ronald Reagan. Let's talk about this remarkable relationship that you two had. You know, it's been described as fairy tale and storybook and two halves of a circle. Can you put it into words?
It was hard to put into words. Patty said at one point that we completed each other, and I think that's true. I was very lucky. I really was. We met at a time that was just right for both of us. I mean, he was everything I ever wanted, and I guess he felt the same.
Ronald Reagan was a letter writer. He sent thousands to people from all walks of life. But to Nancy, they were love letters, and he sent them throughout their marriage.
Ronnie was always a very sentimental, romantic man, always. And he'd do amazingly thoughtful things. Like on my birthday, he'd send flowers to my mother, thanking her for having me. And again, those letters, to me, some of them were written with me sitting right there in the room.
So what's the lesson? Here's a chance to hand something down to the future, because not many people make it to 50 years.
I know.
So there's got to be some advice.
I think many times now they go into a marriage thinking, well, if it doesn't work, I can always get a divorce. That never entered my mind, or Ronnie's. I had a letter from a woman who was going to be married, and she wanted advice. And I wrote her back, I remember, and I said, well, I had never written a blueprint for marriage, but, you know, there's 50-50. Sometimes you give 90 and the other one gives 10, or the reverse, and you have to be willing to do that. For me, my life was Ronnie and my children.
That's an Arabian, and this is an Anglo-Arab. Thoroughbred and Arabian.
What was it about that ranch that's so connected with Ronald Reagan, and what did that mean for the two of you?
You couldn't go to that ranch without feeling a sense of peace, and for us, coming from Washington to there, it was heaven. It was just heaven. We would get up in the morning, have breakfast, go riding, come back and have lunch, and then he was off to work with trees or whatever, and and he'd come back to the ranch house about 5:30, so dirty and loving it. Loving it.
We look at pictures together, their memories now. Here, the ritual after riding.
He had a certain way that I was supposed to get off the horse, and I did. I was supposed to take my feet out of the stirrups, throw my right foot over, and then slide down, and he'd be there waiting for me, and he'd lift me down, kiss me, and that was it.
All right, so here's the picture of the two of you.
That's at the ranch in the True Love, the canoe. Which sounds ridiculous in today's world, but when I was little and growing up, I always thought that when a man asked you to marry him, that he took you out into a canoe and you trailed your hand in the water and he played the ukulele and he asked you to marry him. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? However, that's what I thought at that time. And on our 25th wedding anniversary, Ronnie made that canoe and called it the True Love. And he took me out and he said, well, I haven't got a ukulele, but I could hum.
For Nancy and Ronald Reagan, March 30th, 1981 began like a typical day at the White House. But by the time the day ended, it would be one that neither the Reagans nor the country would ever forget.
Well, I was at a luncheon that day, and for some strange reason, it's never happened to me before or since, and I hope never will, it got to be dessert, and I suddenly had this overwhelming desire to get out and go home. So I made some excuse, and I got out, went back to the White House. Then George Opfer, who was head of my Secret Service detail, came to the bottom of the ramp and was motioning me to come down. I thought that was funny. So I went down, and he said, there's been a shooting. Well, I was halfway down to the elevator. And he said, but the president's all right. He hasn't been hit. And I said, I'm going to the hospital, George. And even now. So he kept repeating, but he hasn't been hit. And I said, I don't care. I'm going to the hospital. And you either get me a car or I'll walk. When I finally saw him, and he had that thing over his face, and he was absolutely white. I'd never seen anything like that. And he pushed it up and said, honey, I forgot to duck. I pulled it back down and I said, I love you. And
one of the things Patty talked about was his stated desire to forgive John Hinckley. Now that's extraordinary.
Well, he thought that if he could ask God to help him, then he had to ask God to help John Hinckley.
How did you react to that?
Well, I had a hard time. I had a hard time with that.
You're called the protector. Again, you wrote that when it came to people, he could be naive.
Yeah.
What was he naive? What does that mean?
Well, he never believed that anybody would do anything less than honorable with him. My little antenna went up, and I could sense when they were.
And when you sensed that, what did you do?
I told him. Sometimes he believed me, sometimes he didn't. But I told him.
What is it that you were sensing? Just ulterior motives, or what?
They were using him. They were spinning their own version of something that might have happened that didn't happen the way they told it. And I knew it didn't happen.
I take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration.
The Iran-Contra arms for hostages scandal became the worst political crisis of Reagan's presidency. Nancy Reagan weighed in heavily. She brought in outside advisors to convince Reagan of the seriousness of the situation, and she argued successfully that then Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan had to go.
Somebody had to level with Ronnie and tell him he'd been very badly served, very. I mean, people were going off doing things that he knew nothing about. But he found himself in this position, and somebody had to make him face up to it. Because in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. Well, by the time we left, it was very painful. You know, they had a going away party for us at the White House, which we didn't know about. And of course, I began to cry. You know, you get very close to people, particularly in the White House. We'd gone through a lot together, all those people. The shooting, my father's death, the cancer operations, Ronnie's 2 cancer operations, my cancer operation, my mother's death. I mean, you know, we went through it together. Well, we left and waved goodbye to everybody, got in the helicopter, and they circled the White House so that we could see it for one last time. And Ronnie leaned over to me and said, "Look, honey, there's our little shack."
They called it a shack?
Shack.
And then you came back to California, and was he very comfortable, and was it an easy transition giving up the trappings of power, or was that a tough transition?
No, and every transition was easy for Ronnie. Everyone. It was never difficult for Ronnie. Ever.
And then when you came back, what was life like in California?
Well, it was wonderful. We had the house, and did anybody ever tell you the story about the house, buying the house? I was looking for a house, knowing we had to have one. And a friend of mine called and said, "There's this woman who called me, and she's a widow, and her house is going to be up for sale, and she'd like you to look at it." So I came out and I looked at it, and it seemed perfect to me. But I couldn't buy a house without Ronnie seeing it. So the next trip out, we were at the hotel, and I said, we better go see that house. Fine. We got out, and I made him lie on the floor of the car because I didn't want the press to be following us up to that house. That wouldn't make a very good impression on the neighbors.
And you made the former President of the United States lie on the floor of a car.
Yes, I did.
And he didn't say, "I'm the former President of the United States.
No.
What are you making me do?" His exit from the stage, when he left the White House, when he announced his disease and everything, has been remarkably gracious.
He's a very gracious man. And the letter, which I thought was remarkable, he sat in the library and just sat and wrote it. But we did talk first. I mean, we had always gone public with whatever had happened to us, his 2 cancers, my cancer, thinking that it might be helpful to people. And this letter, I think, really was very helpful to people. I think it opened the door, really, for a knowledge about Alzheimer's that people didn't have.
If my 12-year-old came up to you and said, "Tell me about your husband, the president," what would you tell her?
Oh, boy. Well, that he was the most wonderful man that ever drew breath. Well, he is a man who is always completely comfortable in his own skin, completely without guile, no ego, much brighter and much better read than people thought he was, great sense of humor. And I remember what he said it was after the 76 convention, which we lost. And there were a group of young people, and he went out to talk to them. And I can't remember everything he said, but he kept saying to them, don't be cynical. Whatever you do, don't be cynical. Hold on to your dreams.
The only daughter of Ronald and Nancy Reagan, Patty Davis grew up in the public eye. As a toddler, she appeared in commercials with her famous father, and later joined him as he campaigned for California governor and the presidency. But they had profound political differences and an often tumultuous family life. Patty Davis is reflective now. She recalls the rebellion, but mostly the affection she felt for her father. What were the essential building blocks, do you think, of your father's character?
I think one of the important things was his mother, who had very strong faith. And I think that her faith was something that he borrowed from and then sort of made his own. And I think that being the child of an alcoholic father was huge in his life, more than he was consciously aware of, because I think it just is. For any child of an alcoholic, I think that that alcoholic parent always sort of stays twisted in someone's shadow and follows them everywhere and pulls on every experience in their life in one way or another.
How did it shape him?
He wanted to win. He was not going to fail like his father did. And I think what my father has is something that you find in every successful person, and that is that he didn't consider failure as an option. Losses, setbacks were losses and setbacks. They were not failures.
People have said that you could get only so close, but not any closer to Ronald Reagan. Some have used the word aloof or detached. Is that fair?
Aloof and detached, I think, implies a certain coldness. I think elusive is a more accurate description. I think also a lot of it is that he's a shy person. Not shy in front of groups of people, but shy one-on-one. Which is something, it's not that unusual. You find it a lot in actors and in other creative people. You know, people can get on stage or do something sort of huge, but then you get them in a room and one-on-one, they're terribly shy.
How did you see that played out? Can you think of a case or a time when that,
I think that a lot of my father's, a lot of what baffled him about being the father of a daughter was that shyness, I remember coming in and saying, "I'm getting my first bra." Want to see? And I remember, I think it was the first time when I realized that I had embarrassed my father. He was very, very shy.
Your recollections of being a child and being on the ranch with your dad?
Those are the best times. Saturdays we would drive to the ranch and spend the day there. Sometimes we spent the night. They were great, wonderful, long days, because I think when you're a child, the days seem longer, sort of. Riding and swimming up in the pool. There was a swimming pool at the ranch, too.
What was it about ranches and horses and the outdoors and Ronald Reagan?
I think that's where he got his sustenance. I think he got his sustenance in nature and being, getting his hands in the dirt and building things and being on the back of a horse. And he used to say that there's nothing as good for the inside of a man as the outside of a horse. I remember even when I was horseback riding with my father, and he would be really quiet or something, and I would want to talk to him, and I'd say, "Well, what are you thinking about? Why you're really quiet? What are you thinking about?" And he'd say, "Well, I was just talking to God." There was just something that seemed to be restored in him when he was out in nature. He really needed that.
You needed your mom. Let's talk about that relationship for a while, because that is positively remarkable.
It is remarkable, yeah.
Did they just suck the oxygen out of the room for anybody else?
In a way, I described it once in the past as being two halves of a circle. And, coming together, they just sort of make this perfect shape, this perfect sphere. Of course, the little downside of that is that then other people feel that they're sort of orbiting outside of that, including in a lot of ways their children. And I don't think that they intended that. They didn't intend their love to be exclusionary in any way. But I think when you have that kind of the kind of love that they have that you don't find that often, I think just by definition, other people are going to feel a bit left out of that.
Your discomfort with some of his ideology, I mean, it's fascinating. It's just fascinating. And the family dynamic is remarkable. You must have had some interesting conversations with those two worldviews colliding, didn't you?
I think my father was quite baffled by his children as we got older. I think my father was a perfect father when we were younger kids, As we got older and we started questioning, exploring, challenging, and it was part of the times too, particularly my times coming of age in the 60s. When we started doing that, I think he was just sort of nonplussed. I think he was just baffled.
Patty found herself on the other side of a variety of issues, but none more publicly or causing more family fallout than her opposition to her father's military buildup. She became a high-profile part of the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s.
My father and I have different views on this issue, and it can be difficult, and I am discovering a little painful, to differ from someone you love and respect. He was terribly hurt, and he continued to try to reach out to me and talk to me. And, we have nothing to talk about, I know what your ideas are, and I disagree. And I had all these things of, well, you taught me to think for myself.
And he said?
I can't remember. I think maybe he did say, well, do you have to do it like this?
And your mother's reaction?
Well, my mother was devastated.
What did she say?
She was angry. My mother was angry at me. I think, there were long periods of us not speaking and all that. She was angry because I was hurting them, but because I was hurting him.
Did she, presumably she told you that?
Yes.
What did she say? You remember?
That I was embarrassing him, and, how could I be so thoughtless and so careless toward him?
And you said?
Probably not much. I just didn't get it. I was just very, very immature. I was much younger than my 28, 29 years, emotionally.
Discuss it.
I have come around to appreciating so many things that my father gave me as a father, and so many things about him as a human being and as a leader. But I haven't changed my politics. I still think he was wrong. I still think, building up nuclear weapons to build down was a horribly risky idea, and we're just very lucky that it worked. What I have changed and what I see clearly now with the passing of years and hopefully a little bit more wisdom is that the way in which I expressed myself was so destructive and hurtful to my father.
If my 12-year-old daughter came up to you and tugged on your jacket and said, "Tell me about your daddy who was president," what would you tell her?
I would have to tell her about my father. Yes, my father was president, but he was my father first. I'm going to be mourning the man who taught me how to ride a horse and taught me how to get back on after I fell off. and who taught me how to swim, and who took me out into a field on the ranch after a fire came through and it was all blackened, and showed me little green shoots coming up out of the ashes to show me the cycle of life and death. The country is going to be mourning a president. I'm going to be mourning my father.
In 1959, Ronald and Nancy added one last child to the Reagan family, Ron Jr. His youth was spent in Sacramento, where the California governor's mansion served as his playground. His father, a favorite playmate. It would get more complicated as the years went by, the family nearly as public as the father, the 40th President of the United States. What are some of your most enduring memories, do you think, from your early years with him?
We bonded on a sort of physical level, mostly. A lot of it has to do with swimming. First time I ever beat him in a swimming race, and boy, he remembered that for years. He used to talk about that. He'd bring it up out of the blue, well into his 80s. He'd talk about, remembering that time, and it was a little sooner than he thought I ought to be able to beat him, but it was because I knew that flip turn. We were even going into the turn, but it sort of upset him that he was, beaten by his young son when he was only, 60-something, So I remember that, and even when he was governor of California, and this is unimaginable today. I mean, you couldn't even conceive of this. Friends of mine come over from school, and we had a house with a big yard and front yard out there, and we'd want to play football. We had uneven numbers, so I'd go into the house and I'd pester him until he came out and played football with us on the front lawn for hours. And he insisted on quarterbacking both teams. That was the condition for his playing, is that he play quarterback for both sides.
So when you brought your friends over to meet this guy, what did they think of him?
Oh, I think most of my friends found him a lot of fun, because usually it would be in the context of throwing the football around or something like that, and he was just a good dad for that kind of thing. I think he secretly wished that he could always be out there running around in the yard and, playing with the boys.
But he was a hard man to get close to.
Yeah, he was, and that's another one of the paradoxes of my father, is that most amiable man you'd ever want to meet. Friendly to everybody likes him. But that last 10% was tough. He'd hold it back, and and I don't think even his family ever really got down to the bottom of that.
Why do you think that was?
Well, you could play armchair psychologist and say alcoholic father and, all that sort of thing. And maybe that's it. I don't know. But it's there, and it always has been there. Again, it doesn't mean that he's remote and in no way cold. He's a very warm person. But he just held something back and something in reserve, and maybe he needed to. Maybe that was a source of his strength in a certain way. I don't know.
Some have said he was a passive or aloof man.
Not aloof. In a way, in some respects, passive. In the sense that I don't think he had a huge personal ambition, for himself, the kind of narcissistic drive where, boy, if everybody's looking at you, you're unhappy. He enjoyed, being in public and was good at it and derived satisfaction from it, I'm sure, but it wasn't necessary for him, I don't think.
How does someone get to be President of the United States absent that drive?
Well, as long as enough people around you have that drive for you, you can do it. And as long as you have other talents, which he certainly did, pretty damn good communicator, and could connect with people of all sorts, oddly enough. I mean, this guy who's, had been in Hollywood for a long time, made a certain amount of money, was comfortable, but blue-collar guys, farm work, anybody, they somehow could identify with him. Maybe it was because he grew up not impoverished, but somewhat poor, and that there's some sense of that lingered around him that made him identifiable for those people. I don't know, but he had it. Whatever it was, he had it.
Ronald Reagan's presidential agenda revolved around a few key issues that he focused on throughout his entire political career: Reagan supporters viewed this as one of his strongest traits. His critics saw it as a liability. His son saw both sides. The question is, how ideological was he?
He's not a rigid man. He's not an ideologue in that sense. He seeks out compromise where compromise is possible, and compromise is possible almost everywhere except on the bedrock principles that have to do with fairness and justice and things like that.
Did you understand early on his fascination with commitment to certain key issues, taxes, size of government, anti-communism? How did that become part of family or dinner conversation?
We probably didn't have typical dinner time conversations in our house. I think what bothered him about taxes was the idea of an intrusive government, quite simply, that you worked hard for your money, and what real reason did they have to come and take it all away from you? He was, you know, as an actor, he was often taxed very heavily if he made a lot of money. I mean, over a certain amount, he was paying, 90+% taxes on this stuff, and that sort of bothered him. Bothered him that it discouraged him from working in a way. It wasn't worth it to work, and he thought that was wrong. That the government should be encouraging you to work, not discouraging you.
We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people.
There were other issues where Reagan was less focused.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it was, a major focus of his administration. It simply wasn't. I mean, he focused on taxes and the Soviet Union.
Did the acting and did Hollywood, do you think, inform his presidency? And I don't just mean performing in front of the camera, but I mean actual and real experience that he applied, because he was constantly referencing Hollywood in one fashion or another.
The performance aspect is pretty obvious. Clinton gave a pretty good speech, on occasion, but I haven't seen anybody in political life in the years since my father who could, give a speech like he could. He was an artist.
Connecting with an audience, playing to a public?
Oh, certainly there. Yeah, absolutely. It's remarkable watching people now in public life giving speeches and what have you, and when they want to emphasize a point, of course, they get louder. They start to speak louder, and the voice becomes more stentorian, and maybe they'll pound on the podium, and they'll lean in, and they'll do all this stuff. When he wanted to make a point, generally speaking, he'd get quieter.
Where did we find such men?
He'd slow it down, and he'd get quieter, and it made the audience lean forward and come to him. That's not something you just sort of pick up in the Senate cloakroom.
You said that your father was widely misunderstood. What do you mean?
Well, I think there was a lot of people in Washington in particular thought that he wasn't the brightest bulb in the pack. He would admit, I think, that he was often not the cleverest person in the room, and I use that word deliberately. Washington is a town, I think, that values cleverness highly, and there are no shortage of clever people around. I think my dad had something that was a little more important than that, and I'll call it wisdom, and I don't mean to, blow him up into some sort of saint or anything, but clever says that winning is the most important thing. Win at any cost. Winning is everything. Wisdom says that how you play the game ultimately is the game, and I think that's something my father always knew.
A lot of chatter when he came to Washington. We started by talking about the misunderstanding. But what are some of your early memories of that, of coming into this strange and at times hostile place?
Yeah, well, our family was used to that. He'd been governor of California 2 full terms. He'd been, of course, an actor. We were used to him being a public figure. The intensity, of course, is just tenfold when you enter the White House. People change in office. You see presidents, and after a few years in the Oval Office, they're different. They change. I think he changed less than anybody that I've seen. He was just always himself. You wake him up at 4 in the morning, and that's what you're going to get. There's no veneer with him, really. Now, some people mistook that for it all being veneer. The whole thing is just a put-on. That's never been true. He did, of course, have this remarkably sunny optimism. which taken to an extreme can become a form of denial. I can give you one example of that. After the second inauguration, my wife Doria and I happened to be riding in the presidential limousine. Crowds lining the streets, of course, and limousine moving down the street. And he had decided shortly before that he was going to try and encourage people to adopt the thumbs up sign. So he was going around, giving everybody the thumbs up sign. So we're driving along the road here, and the crowds are sort of pressed in on the side, and he's looking out the window of the crowd as a guy leans in. I don't know how he got that close to the car, but leans in with this sort of snarl on his face and hoists another digit in our direction. And without me missing a beat, my father turns to us and says, "See, I think it's catching on."
One of the cornerstone aspects of the Reagan presidency was the Reagans, Mr. and Mrs. A remarkable relationship by any standard. You saw it from an altogether different place and perspective. Explain it.
It's hard to explain. I mean, they of course, have a tremendously close relationship, as you've said. He's always had at least one strong woman in his life, starting with his mother, of course, and ending up, of course, with Nancy. He needed, I think, that sort of feminine presence in his life to take care of his soul, I guess, to be there at home, to provide that sort of emotional foundation for him, somebody who he knew would never do him dirt, who would love him unconditionally. And that's what my mother provided for him. Tremendous source of strength.
And a degree of protection.
Yes, yeah. He's such an agreeable person that he would let people run him ragged if that were allowed, and she would be the sort of gatekeeper that way, and keep people from asking too much of him. You have to remember when he entered the White House, he was virtually 70 years old, so he's already a somewhat elderly guy. I mean, great shape and all, but you get to that age, you're not going to go all night. He's a little older than that, and so he needed to marshal his strength, and she knew that, and would make sure it happened.
When it came to personnel, when it came to the schedule, when it came to his physical safety, she took it upon herself to be a very tough protector. Yeah. Well, I mean, their lives are inextricably intertwined, and, she couldn't imagine. I mean, after the shooting happened, of course, just a couple of months after he took office, and boy, you have your husband gunned down in the street. That's no fooling around. How did she change after that?
Well, she became somewhat paranoid about his safety. I mean, and even more protective, of course. She'd make sure he wore that bulletproof vest if the SS boys said he should.
Really?
Oh God, yeah. She didn't want to take any chances with him. And again, he nearly died, and at that age, it's tough to bounce back from something like that. So after that, he needed a little more rest and a little more care.
A lot of people have said with the relationship between Ronald and Nancy Reagan that there just wasn't much room for anybody else. Fair point?
Yeah, I think that's fair to a degree. I mean, I know that all the children have felt that at one time or another, some more than others. It was a very close relationship, and it could at times become almost an exclusive one.
What do you think was the toughest moment for him of his presidency?
Well, the whole Iran-Contra thing, other than the shooting, which goes without saying. I think the Iran-Contra business. I think it was one of the things very difficult for my father, because he's almost preternaturally honest and decent, is to understand that people who he trusted and who worked with him would go behind his back and do something really stupid and then lie about it. So it took him a while, and it took him aback. It took him a while to sort of get up to speed with that and really cope with it, I think.
He did approve the arms transfers to Iran.
Oh, the arms transfers to Iran was purely about, there were these people over there who were being held hostage, one of whom had already been tortured to death, and he'd met their families. He wanted those people out. He wanted to get those people back to their families, and he was going to do just about anything he could. Yeah, you got to send a couple of Stinger missiles to some mullah in Iran? Fine, we'll do that if that can get these human beings back where they belong. Now, the Contra part of it, he knew nothing about.
Did he talk to you about those hostages?
Yeah, in those terms.
What?
You know, he knew that one of them had already been tortured to death again, and that, I mean, if you know my father, you know that his heart bleeds for people. When there's specific people as opposed to, you know, a group, a class of people, you know, he gets very emotionally involved in that. It's like the woman who he sent the check to that time. You know, the thing where you saw her on TV, so he wrote out a check for $2,000 to send it to her. Well, there she is on the news then, you know, with it framed on her wall. So what does he do? He writes out another check and encloses a note saying, this time, cash it.
At the height of Iran-Contra, it became clear that some changes had to be made to control the damage. The president himself was reluctant to act.
At a certain point, Don Regan became a liability to the administration, and everybody knew it. And my mother was trying to press him to, you know, you've got to replace him. And my father's reaction was, I'm not going to fire somebody to save my ass.
You heard that?
No, but my mother did, and she related it to me. Now, I can think of a lot of presidents who would never have that thought, and those words would never pass their lips. But he meant it.
Don Regan ultimately got fired.
Don Regan ultimately got fired, but if it had been left up to my dad, boy, you know, loyalty, he just wouldn't have done it. Good old Don, you know, he's been with us for years. You know, I'm not going to dump him just because it's going to help me.
How do you think he'll be remembered by history?
Well, I don't know. In different eras, he'll be remembered different ways. You know, history is sort of malleable. People, it changes as we go. Again, if he's remembered correctly, whatever you think of his politics or his policies, he'll be remembered as an honest and decent man.
In many ways, Ronald Reagan's family, like all families, reflects the world beyond. Imperfect, complicated, often conflicted. But few live their lives so publicly, or with a personality who loomed so large for so long. For the History Channel, I'm Frank Sesno. Thanks for watching.